Hello, Theology of Evangelism folks. I really appreciate what you've been doing with the discussion board looking at COVID and the church. And rather than make you read one more thing, I thought I would put this little video together to give you my thoughts and to respond to much of what you've been saying. So welcome to my little makeshift board and classroom here. I hope that you can read some of this on there. I know it's not that big, but I'll be narrating through it. So first of all, great responses. Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing from your various ministry standpoints. It was really especially helpful to hear from people who are in different ministries, not just congregational, but Claudia was writing about her work as a chaplain in the hospital and reaching out to COVID patients. And then those of you who are offering international perspectives and how you're trying to connect across the various regions and parts of the globe where people can connect, which it's interesting. There's some new capacity to do that because folks are so much more engaged online now than they used to be, and that's actually helped to collapse some of the borders that used to get in the way of these sorts of things. So thank you for your engagement, both in sharing your stories and writing back to each other. Let me walk you through both a reflection on what you've been writing, because you'll hear a lot of what you've said reflected here, and also my own thoughts. And as I've been doing reading and pondering on the COVID situation and how the church can respond to it, especially in a way that shares the Christian faith. So the way I've got this set up is pre-COVID, pre-C, and post-COVID, post-C. And I think it's important that we start by putting that framework in place, because in many ways, that's sort of how we have the opportunity to think about things here. It's not just that we were forced into dealing with COVID, but as we think about how we're going to be the church and offer a Christian witness to the larger world, we've got an opportunity here to think about it in a couple of ways. One is, are we just trying to drive back to the pre-COVID world to try to make things look like they used to look? Or are we trying to cast a vision for what the church will look like after we come out of COVID? And in many ways, I think it's unrealistic to think about going back to the pre-COVID world. And that's simply because too much has changed for too long. I mean, it's going to have been over a year that we're dealing with many of the things that we're dealing with. We've been in various states of quarantine, and we've had to modify our traditions just long enough, all the way through all of the major holy days of the calendar for Christians, that I don't think we are going to be able to go back to the pre-COVID ways. We're going to have to, at best, have a hybrid of the pre-COVID ways with new ways. And really, we can't think of that as something that's an aberration, but really, that's just the way church is going to look. And I don't think that's something we should be afraid of. The church has had to adapt and modify all the time. This is where contextual awareness in the evangelism equation comes in. If the church was going to be effective, it was going to have to understand its context and would have to adapt over time. Our church doesn't look like the house meetings of the first century church of the book of Acts. We just don't. We don't speak the same language. We don't gather in the same way. It's just a completely different thing. Our church today doesn't look that much like the movement that John Wesley spawned. We're much more institutional and hierarchical and have all kinds of bureaucracy that he didn't have. The church has adapted as it's moved from culture to culture, as it's moved from time to time throughout the centuries. It's just a matter of reality, and it's going to adapt again. And we get to be part of that. So we may not be excited about it, but that's the reality. That's the time in which we've been given to steward the message of Christ. And so here's our opportunity to think about how we're going to do that. So what I want to do is give you a sense of how a series of different areas have all been thought about in the pre-COVID era and sort of where we're being pointed to in the post-COVID area in terms of being the church and offering our evangelistic witness. So the first area here is structure. That's what this says here. In terms of structure, the pre-COVID church really was most interested in the church gathered, right? The idea is that we would gather together. And as we gathered, we would have all kinds of special things that we would do. right? Our worship services, our Bible studies, our Sunday schools, various kinds of other small groups. We would gather. That's what we were all about. And that's precisely what got disrupted. Our usual structure got disrupted, right? And so all the money we dump into our buildings, all the money we put into maintaining facilities, it all went for nothing in a lot of ways because we couldn't gather anymore. But the whole logic of gathering is what, in many ways, we were driven by, physically gathering together. Post-COVID is less about the church gathered and more about the church scattered. Now, that's not a bad thing, if you think about it. Because at the end of every worship service, what do? Well, at least if we follow a normal worship tradition, we offer a benediction and we send people back out into the world to be the church scattered, to go be the witness of Christ in the world. Right? The gathering is just a brief moment of Sabbath where we can come together and we can be reaffirmed in our faith, where we can enter into the presence of the holy as a community, but then be sent back out as those who walk with Christ out into the world. And as we are going, right, from the Great Commission, we are witnesses to make disciples. Post-COVID has emphasized the church scattered. We still can gather. It's not that gathering has disappeared. We do it in different ways, right? We gather by Zoom or we gather in other sort of digital ways. But even after COVID is done, when we're allowed to gather together, I would argue that it is going to be a serious mistake to think about this being the only and really seriously the major way that the church operates. We need to remember that really where the church is most effective as a witness is when it's scattered. When people are out in the midst of going about their daily business, that's where the real missional work of the church happens. And so we'll gather, but I hope we hold on to the idea of the church scattered being where it really matters. And actually, I'm working on a book right now. Hopefully it'll be out in about a year, that actually has a series of new metrics. So we're not just measuring what it's like when we all get together, we're measuring the impact our churches make in terms of bringing salvation to the world around us. That's where we really determine whether the church is doing its work. After structure, the next thing is logistics and skills, right? Now the logistics and skills, and this is seen in the seminary curriculum, has in the pre-COVID church focused really on ritual, right? The idea that there are various rituals, sacred rituals, that we have to get together and we have to perform. This can be the way that we do our liturgy. It can be the sacraments. It can be even every local church kind of has its own little rituals, even if they're not like the grand sacred rituals. It could be the way that people gather for worship or for fellowship afterward and have coffee together or have snacks or anything. There are all kinds of rituals that were connected to gathering, right? And that was very important. Now, I'm not saying that's out altogether. Sacraments and gathering in ways that we can continue our liturgy, our singing together, our fellowshipping together, all that's going to be important. But in the post-COVID world, the logistics and skills really had less to do with these kinds of formal rituals and had more to do with simply providing a way for people to be able to connect with each other. It was about connecting. We needed new skills and new logistics. So this was happening through Zoom. This was happening through all kinds of other digital platforms, whatever platforms you may have thought about. And as some of you wrote about, over time, you figured out how to modify these rituals to make it more effective in connecting with people. Because the number one concern was finding a way to make sure that we connected with each other. And so that was critical to bring people together. But the interesting thing is, we didn't just connect with each other, we also found ways to begin connecting to the larger world in ways we had never really thought about before. Because we had been so focused up here on being gathered, right, that we never really thought about how do we connect to people with our worship service, with our Sunday school classes, with our small groups in a way that allowed folks outside the church to have a kind of easy entrance to them and try them out. But when suddenly we were all digital, it was a lot easier for people to just kind of come in and lurk and check out what was going on. And a lot of us saw big upticks in that. I got emails from students who were telling me that they'd get, 1,000 hits on their children's message for the week simply because folks were looking for stuff. They were looking for ways to be able to connect with something else that they never would have otherwise. And so all of the logistics and skills dealt with this connecting, and the rituals came underneath that. And I think that's something we have to continue thinking about. What are our skills and rituals for? Well, they're for connecting people to people. They're also for connecting people to God, right? They're not ends in themselves. And that was the danger of the pre-COVID church, is we thought about the rituals as ends in themselves. But really, they're meant to serve connecting people to people and connecting people to God. And so that's something that became clearer through this, and it just happened through a digital lens. It could have happened in another way instead. This ties us then into the next piece, which is relationships. Relationships in the pre-COVID church really were primarily focused on internal relationships, right? It was the internal fellowship of the church. How do we take care of each other? How do we make sure that we're praying for each other, we're supporting each other, we're gathering, again, with each other, right? And that's important. We still want to be able to maintain that kind of pastoral care. We still want to maintain that kind of fellowship. So that's something we still should be doing. And a lot of people, as you read in the little packets that I put up on the Church and COVID piece for Moodle, that's a big part of what happened, was figuring out how do we maintain this kind of internal connection so people still have a sense of not being alone, of being part of a church family, of a church community, right? So writing letters to each other, making phone calls to each other, making time to make sure that we maintained those relationships internal to the church, even when we weren't gathering to see each other on Sundays. In a lot of ways, the church was forced to be more intentional about that than we used to be, because we just always assumed we'd run across each other in our weekly gatherings or in our bi-weekly gatherings if we got together on, say, a Wednesday night and a Sunday morning. Now we had to make a point of reaching out to others that wasn't facilitated by the church just being in a gathered state. So that's good, but then beyond that, in post-COVID, what we want to do is not only have that intentionality, right? There was intentionality that happened that was both internal and external, right? So we're not just looking at here internally when we gather, we're maintaining our relationships, but we're being intentional about building those relationships outside of our gathered state. When we're still scattered, we're intentional about it. And we're not just looking to support the internal relationships that we've got within the church, but also to build the external. How is it that we really are connecting with our neighbors? How is it that we really are making a point of supporting one another, right? That in the larger community. This was an opportunity because we're all in this boat together in a lot of ways. Whether we all agree on masks or not, whether we all agree on the various kinds of governmental lockdowns or not, the thing is, we all still had to deal with the fact that life had changed, right? And all of us feel a little bit more isolated, and all of us feel a little bit more like, we're sort of cut off from our daily rhythms and our monthly rhythms and our annual rhythms, right? This is something I've heard a lot recently, is people saying, well, Christmas is coming and we're putting up the lights earlier because we just need to believe, right, that Christmas is coming, that it'll still be more or less the same. The number of hits on YouTube videos that show Christmas music has shot way beyond what it usually does this time of year, simply because people are so desperate to try to hold on to something that makes them feel like the normal rhythms of life are more or less still going on, because so much of that has been disrupted, right? I mean, it feels like this year went by and somehow it feels like the year never did go by at the same time because all of our rhythms are disrupted. That much we are all in really experiencing together. And so building these external relationships becomes so much more powerful because we really do have a common basis on which to operate. And there can be intentionality in that. How are we reaching out to our neighbors? literally to the people who live in the apartment or in the house that's right next to ours. How are we reaching out and connecting with them? How are we helping them know that they're humanized and they're not alone? Something we can do both internal to the church but also externally, and there's a welcome to that. People are ready to know they're being humanized by somebody else because it feels like so much of our humanity is getting stripped away and we're just kind of all moving around in a diminished state these days. So in the post-COVID, right, because we're more focused on the church scattered and we're getting better in our skills to connect, we can maintain intentionality both internally and externally, right, in building relationships. That brings to another point, and this is something that can help facilitate that, and that is working towards the common good. Right? Now, this is something the church has done for a long time. A lot of what the church does as part of its witness, and a lot of what we believe is salvific, right, is also what the larger world, even if it's secular or it's a different religion, believes is part of the common good. So Jesus says that part of the salvation that he brings is to feed the hungry. It's to cure the sick, right? Right now, think about that. Curing the sick, that's a big deal. And everybody thinks it's a great idea. It's part of the common good. Feeding the hungry is part of the common good. We all agree with that. It's just that we happen to have a salvific grounding for it that pushes us in that. Now, in the pre-COVID church, I'll be honest, most of the churches who did this kind of work did it out of a kind of humanitarian way of thinking. In other words, this is just a good thing to do. It was in many ways buying into the logic of the culture around us. This is just a good thing to do, and the Bible happens to say it's a good thing to do too, so, we can check two boxes at once. But that's about as far as we ever went with it. All right? So it was mostly this kind of thinking. Now, because there's this greater intentionality of the church operating in a scattered setting, right, what goes on? Well, what goes on is that the common good becomes a way of talking about salvation. We can actually become intentional in explaining how the common good is part of the salvific work that Jesus brings. Right? So when we're feeding the hungry, when we are participating in helping healthcare workers, when we're participating in any kind of outreach that's caring for people's basic physical needs or their mental health, or they're supporting people who are lonely, right? Going back up to these relationships that we're building with people outside, externally, right? Those are all aspects of the salvation that God brings. It's not the fullness of salvation. The fullness includes eternity, right? It includes forgiveness of sins. It includes the assurance of eternal life and glory. So, but it gives us an entree because we can begin to say, look, because we believe that God wants to give us an abundant life in Christ, that abundance includes both eternity, but it also includes giving you a full stomach now. It also includes healing you up from your sickness. It also includes reaching out to make sure you're not alone, that you have felt the value and the dignity of somebody reaching out and saying, I will be in relationship with you, and you can be part of my community. Right? Those are all salvific things that we can bring about. And suddenly we can begin to articulate this salvific aspect to working for the common good. Honestly, that's something this church never really tried to do. I mean, there are a few individual congregations that did, but by and large, we were just comfortable saying, it's good humanitarian stuff. It's what nice people do, right? No longer can we do that. We can't just talk about it being nice. We have a way of entering in and saying, this is how we will do good in the name of Jesus to bring about salvation beginning in this world so that we can lead on to guiding people into the fullness of abundant life into the next, right? That's what we can offer. That work of the common good becomes invitational to experience all of the abundant life of Christ. We can explain that, and others can be invited into it. And that leads us to another piece, the ministry of all. right? Now before, in the pre-COVID church, when we would gather, because there was a kind of hierarchical structure, right, the ministry of all, we believed in it as Protestants, but in many ways what that meant was simply that we believed that that the pastor did the heavy lifting, right? And everybody else kind of served on committees, right? Or on various kinds of task forces or groups or whatever. So the lay people were invited to be part of the ministry, but they did it in service to the church institution, right? It was a very institutional understanding of what it was to gather and to engage in ministry. In the post-COVID church, right, that institutional structure is not really what matters. What matters is that we are engaging in leadership development, in discipleship development, so that as people are scattered out in the world, they're able to engage in the full witness without having to be overseen by the pastor to engage in, real spiritual ministry. Everybody has to be equipped for that. So this is about formation, right? It's about forming everyone to engage in the fullness of ministry, right? Not just supporting the institutional church for when we're gathered, but being formed to be a full witness, a full evangelist, right, of the gospel. And that formation means that people are formed as leaders, that they're formed as disciples, right? This gets all the way back to what I was making the argument for in those earlier lectures about our imagination and about character formation. That's part of what we have to do for evangelism anyway. This forces it on us in a lot of ways to live in the post-COVID church. Because if we're not doing this, then we're going to be ineffective as we're scattered. We're not going to be having an impact on the larger culture around us. We're not going to be having an impact on the lives of those who are around us. And what are we supposed to be doing for those lives? We're supposed to be helping them show that we're involved in the common good for salvation, right? So they can be invited into it. And here's another piece, right? And this comes from just brand new research that's been done. In fact, there's a book, I've got it over here on my desk somewhere. Excuse me just a second as I go rummaging through my books. Here we go. Beth Severson, she's a professor at North Park University who teaches evangelism, not done yet. It's a great book. It just came out a couple months ago. And one of the things that she showed is that the most effective churches, now granted this is pre-COVID, but it's the kind of church that's going to thrive in the scattered world, or in the scattered sense, and that is they're churches that don't just engage in this formation among established leaders, right? They engage in this formation among people who are brand new to the church. So she makes the argument that we don't just engage in belonging before believing, right? That's a long time held idea. The idea that we let people sort of belong to the church before they make a statement about their faith. That's something that John Wesley did with the class meetings, right? People would come because they wanted to flee from the wrath to come, not because they had yet decided they would make Jesus their Lord and Savior. They would simply come to kind of learn about what it means to be a Christian. And according to studies that have been done, it took them somewhere around 18 months, most of them from the time they joined a class meeting to when they actually made a profession of faith. Likewise, she says we need belonging before believing, but she also says we need participating before committing. How do you do that? You do that by, as you build these external relationships and people are connecting with you and they're like, hey, you're like a decent person. You're reaching out to me and you're showing that I matter. You're giving me my dignity and all that. And then what you do is you invite them to engage in acts of common good with other Christians, right? So even though we're not gathered, there are times we can get together and we can all hand out, PPE, to people in healthcare, or masks to folks who need them in the neighborhood, or food, needs to be passed out, or right now Christmas gifts, or whatever it might be. There are ways that we can do that, have drive-through things, whatever. And we say, hey, do you want to come along and support us in this? It used to be that this kind of common good stuff, this humanitarian work, it was really reserved for the high-level Christians, right? It was when you were really high level, then you would volunteer to go do the mission stuff, right? The lower level folks were supposed to just stay on the committees that worked internal to the church. But the high level Christians, they could go outside of the church. Now, what Beth Severson argues, is that instead, we should make this our entry point. So we invite people, come along. Hey, I bet you're interested in helping people eat this Christmas. I bet you're interested in helping, kids who are from poor families have a good Christmas. Why don't you come along and you can join us in our work for the common good? And we can say we do it because of our belief in the abundant life given through Christ, right? And then as we do that, what happens? They begin to be formed. These external folks begin to be formed as disciples and even as leaders in the church because they're being given an opportunity to claim some of the ministry that we're engaging in for the common good out of the logic of salvation, right? And so this has just shifted our whole way of thinking about it. The ministry of all isn't about serving the institution. It's about forming people so that they're disciples who are being involved in this witness of the salvation of Christ. And even those who are external to the church, who have not yet believed, who just are interested in doing things because of a humanitarian way of thinking, fine, let them come in and let them participate in engaging in this kind of salvific work alongside of Christians who now can articulate why the common good is part of our salvific vision. Finally, one thing to talk about, and that is partnerships. And by this, I mean partnerships with other churches or with social agencies, other organizations, nonprofits that are out there. Pre-COVID, this was just seen as a kind of sort of a multiplying effect, right? At best. The idea was that we can kind of share our way of thinking. We can and share the burden of getting stuff done. So a bunch of churches, one of the churches that I pastored, a bunch of churches in that city, mine included, got together and we pooled our money to help create a little nonprofit that would serve the poor and the underprivileged and the homeless that were in our city. Right? So that's a good thing. I'm not knocking that. It's a good thing that was happening, but it was very much just a matter of kind of multiplying our ability as churches, along with this new nonprofit, to be able to care for the people who are around us. And that was about it, right? That's as far as it went. And then in many ways, once it was set up, it sort of operated. We would all pay in our portion of what we had promised to pay in, but there really wasn't much interaction beyond that anymore. Once a year, the director would come and speak at each of the churches, and that was that. It really was just about kind of multiplying the ability to work out there, but it wasn't about any kind of real relationship building or growth on the part of any of us. In the post-COVID world, these partnerships become much more critical, not simply because we're now engaged in the salvific work of the common good, and we're talking about that. And so partnerships give us a way to engage in the common good more efficiently, more effectively with our resources, right, through that multiplying effect. But also because it gives us an opportunity, now that we understand ourselves as the church scattered that is offering salvation through intentional connections and relationships externally and all that, this gives us a way to be a social witness much more effectively, right? So we're not just paying into the local social service agency that we help set up, but then letting them take care of everything afterwards. We're actually becoming a social witness because we're forming the people that are going out and making a difference and engaging as they connect in the world as the church scattered. And we as a congregation, as a whole church, can become a social witness by being Christians, not just humanitarians, but Christians that think about things in terms of salvation as we're engaging with other organizations. right? And we're not going to pull that back, but it becomes a social witness that can then leaven the entire work that's being multiplied out by gathering together and supporting with each other. And also, that social witness happens because people see churches agreeing with each other, working with each other. So often we tend to think congregationally, right? The idea that each congregation is sort of basically in competition with every other congregation, right? If somebody goes to the Presbyterians, they're not going to the Baptists or to the Methodists. And so we compete with each other. This moves us past that, and people see that. They say, they see that we may have slightly different ways of articulating specific aspects of our beliefs, but at the end of the day, we come together because we love God and we love our neighbor, and we want to work for that. We're not as concerned about getting people to come to our church. We're more concerned about letting the abundant life of Christ flow through us to others. And if they're attracted to our congregation, great. If they're attracted to the Presbyterians or the Baptists or the Orthodox or the Catholics, great. The key issue is that the whole culture, the whole society around us becomes transformed because of the witness we've got. Now, this is something that's happening in some ways already. There's a social witness that's being formed around a kind of secular humanitarianism. You see it in commercials that are on all the time. You see it, in these kinds of commercials where it shows people like helping each other and supporting each other, and that's all great. What I'm suggesting is the church needs to grab a hold of that and then tie it into a bigger narrative than just let's help each other out because we're all stuck in this same situation. We need to tie it intentionally into this narrative that we're scattered as those who are the witnesses of Christ for the salvation of Christ, right? The abundant life that Christ offers. That's where the church really needs to go. We have a moment here before this new kind of humanitarian, common good sort of social witness that's happening more secularly, before that completely ossifies and takes hold. Because once it does, you know as well as I do, the church tends to follow culture. Why? Because we're all cultural creatures, right? The people who go to the church live in that same culture and are affected by it. Here's an opportunity for us to grab a hold of that narrative and shape it in the larger meta-narrative of what God is doing through Jesus Christ in the power of the Holy Spirit to offer the abundant life to all creation, right? And if we can do that, we make it something evangelistic. We give it a better story. And Christmas is the best time to do that, because right now, people are beginning to realize they need something bigger to hold on to. They need to have these ways of marking time, right? Of marking a sense of change. And the Christmas story, thank God for Charles Schulz and Linus and Peanuts, at least people expect that the Christmas story gets told this time of year. And this is a chance to do it with this kind of logic lined up. So, all that to say, thank you for what you've been thinking about, how your congregations, your other ministry sites are working with COVID. And I hope that this little outline here helps you to think about how you can begin to establish a post-COVID church that will build on the opportunity, even if it was not one we wanted, but it's an opportunity we've been given to steward the gospel in the current COVID and post-COVID reality that we'll be facing. Thank you all. It's been a pleasure. God bless.